Hello all. I'm going to continue my week 5 lectures today with settlement houses. That's continuing from the progressive movement. Settlement houses are an important item in the progressive movement. We're going to talk about what do residences, research, and reform all have to do with each other. What is a settlement house? Have you assumed that they were the precursors to homeless shelters? And if you know what a settlement house are, what are their impact? This lecture will define settlement houses, identify the women who started them, address the religious, economic, and political influence that shaped them, and magnify the impact of the class, race, gender, and ethnicity on these settlement houses. Okay, so the origins of the settlement house go back to England, and that's Toynbee Hall in 1884. It brought together privileged and underprivileged people, people with resources reaching out to people who were impoverished. The original intent was to deal with spiritual and social disintegration. American college graduates often celebrated the completion of their studies by traveling abroad after graduation. So then they brought this model back to back to America, brought this new model. It adapted in the U.S. and it changed a little, much like the Elizabethan poor laws we talked about in week 1. It was typically non-sectarian. English institutions were more commonly social Christianity, whereas American institutions were a little less so. Needed to deal with immigrants. That's a huge difference between England and America, is that in America, one of the primary issues of the impoverished were new immigrants to this country, and clearly they're going to have special needs above what they were dealing with in England. The U.S. was more concerned with social reconstruction than personal redemption, and the U.S. emphasized environmental and political origins of social problems, which led to an emphasis on research and activism. There's a rapid growth of settlement houses in the U.S. So in 1890, there were 4 of them. By 1900, there were 100. And by 1910, which is just the space of 20 years, there were 400 settlement houses. The purpose was to shift from previous initiatives more about social reform than charity. And that's a really important difference in the idea of how it would be structured and the thought process behind it. Goals were to bridge the gap between the classes and the races, eliminate sources of distress, improve urban living and working conditions. The progressive movement is very concerned with the urban environment, and it really is a very urban movement, and it's concerned with what's happening in these intensely packed urban environments. It's also, their tagline was residence, research, and reform, and those are kind of the 3 words that sum up settlement houses. They began meticulous empirical reconstruction of ethnic, occupational, industrial, and housing patterns within the city neighborhoods, and it's the early origins of urban sociology. Similarities of settlement workers to charity workers. So some of the things they had in common was they believed that the personal shortcomings contributed to wants and insecurity. People were, though, adversely affected by the circumstances of city life. Unemployment, low wages, high cost of living, unsanitary, unhealthy living conditions, poor health and inadequate health care, dangerous working conditions and industrial accidents, child labor, lack of security in old age. It relies on volunteers, motivated people from the privileged class. It was interested in spiritual as well as material conditions. It viewed the middle class values as ideal. So we've talked about that in the past, that charity workers very much idealized white Protestant middle class values. And this will to some degree continue that tradition, and really, especially the middle class values, assume that that's what's best for everyone. It believed in a scientific approach to problems. We talked about that last week, that the charity workers and the friendly visitors are really beginning to become more scientific in their collection of data. Conservative response to cultural diversity and social fragmentation. And that's, once again, some of these ideas are going to be ones of social control. They're both interested in spiritual uplift. While it's not the primary focus of settlement houses, it definitely is a part of them. And they're both interested in order and efficiency, which becomes even more important in the progressive age. As I mentioned in my progressive movement lecture, some things that come about during this period are managerial kind of and factory reforms that make things more streamlined and efficient. That's a very important concept to the progressives. They both were interested in spiritual uplift. Sorry, I believe I already said that. Shared commitment to helping the poor. But their approach differed. The 1893 economic depression revealed that cultural uplift was not enough to lift people out of poverty. And we really begin to accept the kind of societal influences that lead to impoverishment. The differences between the settlement workers and the charity workers. They worked with everyone. They did not distinguish between worthy and unworthy poor. While there are aspects of social control, they wouldn't not help someone if they didn't meet some kind of guideline. They addressed social and economic conditions of poverty, not individual or moral lives. They were concerned with systematic poverty rather than dependence. They focused on social justice more than private charity. They promoted democratic ideal of principle and action rather than embody inequality. Although there are some religious ideas and missions. Addressed group progress rather than individual improvement. Settlement houses effectively promoted reform. While we're going to talk about an impact, they're very local, so they don't have a national impact the way you might hope. What they did, they were very effective at, and they really helped a lot of people. The activist approach to the roots of poverty, educational, cultural, and political roots of poverty. So, you know, again, a little less focused on the personal failings idea and more on the systematic things that promote poverty in not only this generation, but future generations. Unmarried women living in the community versus married women who visited and left. So as opposed to the friendly visitors, which is an idea we talked about last week, these unmarried women actually lived in settlement houses. And that really changes not only, I think, their perceptions of the people that they're helping, but it changes the people they're helping's perception of them. You know, we're not seeing someone who's kind of coming from the outside and judging them, but someone who is really a part of their community. Identity. Who were these social workers? They were single women and men. As I mentioned, they're residents, not visitors. 90% were college educated and 50% had attended graduate school. So that's huge considering how few people attended college, especially to think about the percentage of settlement workers who were college educated. In 1900 in the U.S., only 2% were college educated. So of this very small percentage, a lot of them went into these settlement houses and did this kind of what will become social work. In 1975, there are 22% of college degrees, and in 2013, 33.5% of people from 25 to 29 will have a bachelor's degree. The average age of 25, about half went directly from college. Some settlement houses resembled residents' experience in college, so for them it was a very familiar environment. For them it provided fellowship and stimulation, a communal living. Little opportunity for college-educated women anyway. For a lot of women who were college-educated, law, medicine, business, and ministry were closed to them. So this was an opportunity not only to do some good for impoverished people, but to put their college degree to use in an occupation. The average length of their stay in a settlement house was 3 years. They were well-to-do native-born Americans, mostly from the Northeast or the Midwest. As I mentioned, this is an urban movement. This is not going to address as much the social reform in any kind of rural area, which is why you're going to also see it's more of a northern idea and less southern because it's less agricultural. And while there is some attempts to industrialize the South after the Civil War, it still is a lot of rural population. The first generation of American college graduates to come of age in an industrial commercial society where there's clearly no defined place for them. There is not necessarily a place, especially for women, to put their degree to use. And so this gave them an opportunity to really do some good, and as I said, put their degree to use. Developed careers for themselves and helped others who were struggling. There's no place for college-educated women to work. Only teaching and nursing were the only acceptable careers for women. Many alienated from society in which they grew up. Journalists and graduate students in sociology, political science, and economics were often their majors in college if they went into settlement work. So they attempted to create a very organic community in a single location. These settlement houses house a lot of different programs, including kindergartens, daycares and nurseries, men's clubs, libraries, gymnasiums, penny-saving banks, kitchen, employment bureaus, music halls, social centers, which included ethnic and religious groups, trade unions, community hospitals, and they also provided classes. And you're going to look and see that there's a lot of classes that focus on domesticity for women. You know, a white middle-class woman knew that women needed to be able to learn to do these things for their family. So that included arts and crafts, sewing and cooking. And then there's also language and citizenship classes. So the settlement houses are not successful for everyone. One area that they're going to be less successful at is African Americans. So really the focus is going to be on immigrants and what we would mostly consider white immigrants. Their large populations are in the South. Significant migration north had still not occurred. In 1900, blacks made up 2% of the New York population, whereas 40% of the New York population was foreign-born white groups. And then in Chicago, they made up less than 5%. We're going to look in the future at World War I a little bit, and that's really when African Americans start moving north. So World War I doesn't start until 1914, and that's when we're going to see the first real movement into urban areas. And as I said, this is a northern urban movement for settlement houses. Poverty and racial discrimination were pervasive in the U.S. I mean, that's another problem, is that, you know, discrimination will color how some settlement workers and progressives look at African Americans and look at their poverty. Some settlement houses did include blacks and fought racial discriminations, you know, Bassett Place. Some settlement houses encouraged Black pride and African American cultures. Some played a part in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, and the National Urban League. And the National Urban League, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is a great place to look at a group that focus more not only on civil rights, but they also have a little more focus on social reform, and I think that's because they really focus on urban centers and come to prominence as the 20th century moves on. Other people persisted in racism and viewed the whites as superior, so they did not necessarily want to help African Americans. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the impact. It produced literature on urban ills and tenement life for graduate students. Eleanor Roosevelt worked in a settlement house in New York, and she took the very patrician Harvard graduated, educated FDR to a settlement house, and it had a really profound effect on him. And I think you're going to see the profound effect of the progressive movement on FDR when we look at the New Deal. It was committed to public benefit over private profit. So these were not meant to make any money. They were just meant to benefit the public and to benefit the impoverished. It encouraged cooperative efforts towards community improvement, playgrounds and public parks, better public health facilities, and improved garbage collection. And I know some of these may be forgone in your life and you may not think about them, but urban areas were very dirty. And garbage collection was very much a progressive idea. Some of the other progressive ideas, clean milk, you know, that those child labor reform, these are very progressive ideas. It played a part in the progressive or social movement of the late 19th century and the early 20th centuries with data and astute observation. And as I said, some of these ideas are child labor laws, which is very important to the progressive movement, juvenile courts, which we talked about previously, an 8-hour workday, and a 6-day work week, and tenement housing reform. So standards and regulations for how apartment buildings could be built and what could happen. One thing that we're not really going to look at, but I will probably be posting some about in the forums when we talk about the progressive movement, is Jacob Riis, who did a lot of photographs and pictures where he photographed tenement reform, and he actually was a progressive. He was a progressive who becomes famous for his photographs. He was not originally a photographer; he was a social reformer, and he takes pictures of these horrific conditions in tenement life to show them at lectures he gives, and it really helps lead to some tenement reform and regulation. It has a significant impact on the workers themselves. Settlement workers went on to leadership roles that shaped policy. Out of it comes several organizations, the U.S. Children's Bureau, the National Consumer League, the University of Chicago School of Social Service Administration. Some of the leaders of the settlement movement that go on are Frances Perkins. She's very important. She becomes the Secretary of Labor, and we'll probably talk about her more next week. General Swape, the president of General Electric, Harry Hopkins, the architect of the Federal Relief Program and the New Deal. Post-World War I, it becomes very conservative, and you'll actually see that some of these workers are viewed as dangerous radicals. You know, and I talked about that in my progressive lecture, that there are concerns about socialism and communism when we talk about the progressive movement. And that'll become even more so after the communist revolution in Russia during the First World War. The social impact was limited to local improvement. And so then we have to talk about the reality that in the beginning I talked about how in 20 years we go from 4 settlement houses to 400, which is, it shows you what an important idea this was and how quickly it spread. But at the same time, if you think about just the northern urban areas, 400 settlement houses is not enough to change federally, nationally, ideas of poverty. Instead, this is a very local, it's very few in number considering the enormity of this problem. They were loosely organized by college graduates, so there's no national organization that can kind of help encourage these settlement houses. There continue to be ideological boundaries. Business and political ideologies were very entrenched, and this kind of flew in the face of several of them. And city and state political machines were very powerful. So we're still looking at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, which, as I mentioned, is the Gilded Age, which really means that political and local politics were extremely strong and extremely powerful. And they did not necessarily want to see the proliferation of settlement houses, because one of the ways they controlled the vote was by offering immigrants jobs and opportunities for housing and other things. And if the settlement houses were providing all of this stuff free of charge without any strings attached, clearly that could weaken their power base, and they were very strong. So then our last point during this lecture is social work. Settlement houses are really one of the first major social work movements of the early 20th century, and some people will call Jane Addams, the founder of Hull House and one of the important workers of the settlement house movement, the mother of social work, of modern social work especially, because this is not only is it codified and scientific like social work, but it's really a move away from charity and the idea of charity and giving, and move to a social justice, social good idea, which is what social work is, much more based around. Settlement and charity organizations begin to cooperate, so they work together, and there's not animosity. They'll work with each other via these young college-educated charity workers and friendly visitors. It did not deny the personal frailties and shortcomings contributed to the need. So it still talks about personal issues and how that could contribute to poverty, but it begins to consider the environmental and adverse social and economic factors are the basic cause of poverty. And this is really important, that while yes, these social failings like vices might contribute to the situation that the impoverished find themselves in, but it accepts that there's a basic cause of poverty, and it's outside of the people who are impoverished. Some of you may want to talk about social work, and as I said, settlement houses, the progressive movement, Jane Addams, all these ideas in these first two lectures are really, really important to social work. So be sure you check out my reference slide if that's a topic you're interested in for your final paper. And thanks you guys for your time, and have a great week.